Welcome to another edition of the Magic Sandwich Show. I'm your host, JD Kane, and you probably hear there's a lot of noise here tonight. My daughters just got kittens for Christmas, and so they're losing their minds. And there's really nothing I can do about it, although I should be loud enough that you'll hear me over all the chatter. I will mute as often as possible to try and limit it, but that's just going to be nonstop. There's just no. They're also going to decorate the tree in a minute, and that's going to be a noisy thing. So we're just going to roll with that. Our guest tonight is Christopher Mouty, who really doesn't need much introduction. We all kind of know who he is. And Converse Contender, is that the name? Didn't come through.
Yes, you got it. Thank you.
There it is. Yeah. Who I just met. Hi, what's up? But he and Mouty apparently know each other from way back then.
From the way back.
Yeah, he is a devout atheist and hates God and loves sin.
Something about that doesn't smell right.
Yeah, no, he's a Christian. I don't know any more than that. That's literally all the information I have on is he's a Christian. That's it.
You got it. I'm willing to listen to all the reasons, especially tonight's the worst reasons.
Anyway, the main topic tonight is, I believe, focusing on creationism and how to talk to people who hold that belief. How to better converse, how to better get ideas across. I think that's the general idea. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's what so I can tell you that it was inspired because even though I'm not much of a debater, like I think I debated once online, and it was the Neff debate, right? And he's a creationist. Anyway, and of course I didn't do well. It's not my thing. I'm not good at it. But I've watched hundreds of them, if not, many, many dozens of them. And, from the Kent Hovind ones that just totally got me inspired to be, to start my arc towards what was for me atheist activism, which I quickly kind of fell out of, to also moderating a couple of debates. And in fact, one of the debates that I moderated had a gentleman named Tony Reed supporting the scientific / atheist side of things, or the anti-creationist side, I should say more appropriately. And I want to give him a link in a little bit so he can come in as well. But I think that, because everything is so cyclical, because the amount of people and the kind of people that are contributing to the community are on such heavy rotation that I'm seeing a lot of mistakes, the same mistakes that we've seen, since the beginning of these kinds of debates. And not mistakes like I want to fix your mistakes, like I have the secret. The best that I can do is just open a discussion about it, because I think that depending on what your goal is, like if your goal is just to sharpen your skills so that you can be as insulting as possible and own a creationist, if that's your goal, then I think the kind of discussion that we're going to have tonight's not going to be for you, right? If your goal is to, understand that you're probably not going to be persuading the person you talk to. There might be a couple people listening to you that might hear an argument said by you that they never heard before, and they've heard it in that way or in that context that you might, reach. But, being honest about, hey, sometimes even if I disagree with somebody, I can admit that even if I disagree with their content, I can agree that their process is better than mine. Like that was a good use of that argument, right? And maybe doing the debates, one of the advantages of doing the debates is sharpening your skills to more eloquently make your points in the face of somebody who is a higher level orator. So that's the goal, and just to have a chill conversation about it with atheists, with hopefully with Christians. Hopefully with creationists. But a little bit later, I want to send Tony a link, and I'd like for him to come in and contribute, because he has a really cool channel, like Creation Science Taught Me Real Science or something like that. I'll have to find his actual YouTube page.
I know that series. That's an excellent series. He had a really good one on. The one I've seen a couple times is the one on Kent Hovind, where he was talking about where he brought up the tax evasion, how structuring that, and also like some of the arguments that he used. It's really good.
Yeah.
And
so
I think
Tony was in one of the debates
before. That experience where it's like we discussing these things, we ended up going to look them up ourselves. Like, oh well, I've never heard that thing about information. What's that about? And you find out you didn't have that knowledge before.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, with the topic being that light, I mean, I don't really. I have a place to start. Like I can just kind of spit out a couple of things that I consider suggestions, or I can just go through. Because I have a couple notes. I wanted to come as semi-prepared as possible, right? I can bring up a suggestion, and then one by one we can address it because we have somebody in the room that's a Christian and might be interested in, might have a great perspective on how he approaches these conversations and mistakes that he sees on his team and on the other team, because that's what I'm going to be providing. So
sure, that sounds fine to me. I would just say that I'm going to be underprepared because I was told the topic was going to be bad atheist arguments. So
yeah. Oh well, this fits within the umbrella
of
bad atheist arguments, right? Because so let me take a step back and readily admit that
we could
even
do
though
the
I can
whole, we could do the whole show on bad atheist arguments. There's some real doozies out there.
there are horrific. Yeah, it's going to include that, right? A little bit.
That's fine.
Yeah, like, I would argue that even like the problem of evil in some ways is like a bad atheist argument. It just there's so many problems.
maybe we can start by defining creationism. Then what you consider a creationist? Because if you just mean by that God created everything, is that what you mean by creationism?
I think that there would be, for the sake of discussion, I can think of like two branches of what would be considered creationists. There are what might be considered the biblical literalists that would give the earth and the universe a 6,000 to 10,000 year age. And then there are ones that, another camp that would extend it beyond that, whether it be for intelligent design theories that they use, or maybe Hugh Ross, who is a physicist who is also a creationist, but he just grants longer periods of time, I believe. I might get his name wrong.
So maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe I can pick up there. So you said, and I think this is a point that some people get wrong, but it's common. So what I would say is that you said that some people are biblical literalists, and they take the text literally to mean a young earth or whatever it may be. I would point out what John Lennox pointed out in his book, 7 Days That Divide the World. I believe it's called 7 Days That Divide the World, where he says, wait a second, because there's a difference between literally and literalistically. So I can explain it like this. If Christ says, I am the door, for example, does he mean that he's a doorway, literally? Well, yeah, he does mean literally that he is a door to something else. But if you take him to mean that he's a piece of plywood with a handle, that's literalistically. It's like reading into it more than what was intended. And so I guess we could start there and say, and I would just say up front, like, that's not my position. But I do take the text literal, but what I would point out is, as John Lennox pointed out in his book, 7 Days That Divide the World, or the Earth, I'm sorry if I got that wrong. He says, of course, the term day there, yom, is like if I said back in my day, I'm not referring to a certain 24-hour period. I'm just referring to a period of time, for example. That's just one example of the text. But so it can mean a few manner of things. But maybe we can start right there and you can pick up on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that correction. I was absolutely painting in broad strokes, and admittedly doing so just to kind of give a super basic answer to the question. And exactly what you did was one of the things that I would suggest when agreeing to a format or a topic of debate, right? Like, make sure that your terms are clarified. Because if you're going to enter the battlefield, right, the verbal battlefield, and you both have a different understanding of what the words mean that are in the very topic of the debate, it's going to be, not only is it not going to be satisfying for the people having the discussion, it's not going to be as enjoyable to watch, because you're going to be literally just watching people talk past each other, right?
Great point.
So, but I see that. I see super vague terms attempted to be debated. And I think that a mistake, and this might be, a root of bad atheist arguments, a mistake that I see atheists make is the overconfidence, right? Like, oh, well, I'm an atheist, so I am more rational and reasonable, and like, and when they approach the topic debate like that, I think that it's a mistake because it puts them at a disadvantage, because the person that they're talking to, even though they don't believe in, even though they're not an atheist, that in no way, shape, or form diminishes their ability to use reason and rationality. So you're going against an equal in a battle. I think some atheists approach like they're coming in with leverage and talking down.
Right.
And I think that's a huge mistake, because my personal belief is that sacred texts need to be read in a certain way. And I think that when atheists use those sacred texts against the people who believe it, that they're just stepping into a landscape of landmines of things they just don't understand, right? Because if anyone who seriously studies it, like seriously studies it, talks to a layperson that just reads the surface understanding of the King James Bible, then it's going to be a completely different conversation. And I think I think that might be that we can chalk that up, JD, as like what would go on my list of bad atheist arguments using the Bible.
That's a good point, Chris. So I think you're exactly right, and here's how I would respond to that. Like, for one, so you've probably heard before that never underestimate your opponent, right? But there's another principle that's very similar that I used to hear in sales training and business development in general, is that is when you talk to somebody and you assume that you have this altitude and you go in all headstrong, then you're almost more vulnerable of being shown to be lacking. So, for example, not just lacking, but like it almost is unbecoming of you. For example, if I go around telling everybody, for example, that I'm a great, I play keyboard, and I'm telling everybody, or I play drums or whatever, and I'm telling everybody all the time, right? And then I get somewhere where there's a piano at it, and I jump on it and start playing or whatever, and people are just going like, yeah, we get it, you play. But like if nobody knows you play, and then all of a sudden one day you guys are at a wedding or something, and you hop on and you start jamming, people are gonna be like, whoa, I didn't realize you could do that. So it's I think that's a good point you made. I would say though, to kind of get my position, get the meat of the argument, like I think that people can be metaphysical naturalists and say, hey, look, everything natural can be explained in natural terms. But again, I guess another distinction we probably need to make is the distinction between levels of explanation, because I see this a lot with non-believers, is the different levels of explanation. So they'll say something like, well, God couldn't have done, look at evolution and look how successful the theory is. You think that God could have done this, and it's a mistake to put God and evolution as competing hypothesis or competing explanations, because it could just be that God created everything and then used this natural method by which to bring about human life. And so that's another thing, is miscategorizing explanation. And as some people put it, I believe the guy who invented the automobile his last name was Kahn, if I'm remembering correctly. But let's just say Kahn invented the automobile. Now, if somebody were to ask, what is the cause of the automobile being invented? And one guy goes, well, it's the laws of physics and the law of the combustible engine, and it's aerodynamics, and it's all of these physical processes. Or somebody else says, no, it's Kahn. He's the reason why the car was invented. Those aren't competing hypotheses. In fact, they're not even good hypotheses by themselves. They're only a good explanation of the car when combined. So maybe you can respond to that. And
well, yeah, it sounds like So it sounds to me like the point that you're making is, an extension of the point that I was making, which was to clarify your terms, and which is also going to clarify the arguments, which I think the goal is to prevent crosstalk. So the better you define your terms, and one of the things that inspires this particular suggestion is, and I have to admit that a lot of the suggestions have more to do with the kind of creationists that engage in what I would consider evidentialist apologetics, like the Kent Hovens and Nephilim Free, and people like that. And of course, because I was raised on a pretty heavy diet. I wasn't. Let me rephrase that. I wasn't raised. The amount of Kent Hovind videos that I have watched, I have taken in a heavy amount of him. So he's admittedly biasing me and influencing the suggestions that I have. But when it's like an example of the clarifying your terms trap when it's not done right, is because Kent Hovind considers evolution to be like 6 to 7 different things. If you go into that debate thinking that you are going to limit him to just what we would consider, the scientific theory of biological evolution, right? Like a very specific thing. If you think you're going to go into that debate and be able to use that and have agreement that that is to be used and move forward from there, you're in for a sad awakening, because he's going to bring in, cosmological evolution and chemical evolution and
right.
like every other one of the things that he considers it. So I think that, agreeing ahead of time, what the limitations are of what you're talking about, because, that's where you can be the most creative. Kind of dips into a theory of creativity that, like just one of my armchair theories. It's just, it's freedom within limits. So the more clear the boundaries and limits are, the more creative you can be with presenting your arguments for this laser sharp thing with evidence and things like that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. In fact, a friend of mine, Modern Day Debate, James at Modern Day Debate, he had a debate between Kent Hovind and I don't recall the other guy's name. I really should look it up to give this guy credit, but they were debating on this topic, and I sent in a super chat and to ask Kent Hovind, and he asked him, he said, Converse Contender says, what's the difference between literal and literalistic? The same thing I just explained to you. And he said, his response was just, well, I don't know. I mean, whatever he defines it as. Like, I mean, I don't, get his point, but whatever, maybe he can define it. And that's fine if you don't know what that is. But I would say that his whole thing is based on the fact that you got to take the text literally. So, I mean, I would know that thing, for example, if I had studied this all these years, I would know the difference between those two terms, for example. But another point I wanted to make, though, was that I think, so for myself, I think that, so let me just put this out here and then you can tell me what you think about this. I get a lot. Well, show me God right now. Show me God and show me what you should be able to show him or explain him. You
getting lovins? You getting enough lovins?
One of the problems with that, I believe, is that I don't think so. My response is usually, "Oh, so you want me to show you a supernatural thing in natural terms?" Because I think that may be a category mistake to say. You get where I'm coming from on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could be a methodological naturalist and say, I'm gonna look and search out the natural world, and while I'm doing science, for example, I'm gonna be a strict naturalist. Now, if something were to occur, like let's say a miracle, right, to indicate that maybe there's something else going on at this point, like maybe induction doesn't hold or something, then at that point maybe I would take that into consideration. But I would try and separate the natural and the supernatural in that way. So I mean, I guess what do you think about that as well?
Yeah, well, just abiding by the things that we had just talked about. I would think that supernatural would need to be defined, right?
Sure.
But not that needs to happen exactly right now.
Sure.
But yeah, but when engaging with a discussion about, like, if you can't come to an agreement about methodological naturalism, one of the things I had in my notes is, well, then maybe the debate should be about how you each understand what methodological naturalism is and why, right? So because there one of the suggestions that I was gonna get to later, but I'm glad they're kind of coming out a little more organically by you and I just going back and forth, is the ability to people going into these debates that are going to be upholding a version of informal science communication, right? Because when arguing with specific creationist claims, it very, very frequently is about a version of science that they may be using as evidence in the face of either counter evidence that the scientific community finds more compelling, and consensus of experts, or blah, blah, just being able to talk about these kinds of uncertainties with confidence. And for instance, methodological naturalism, there are legitimate critiques against, in the philosophy of science, there are legitimate critiques against science. There are legitimate critiques against hiding behind methodological naturalism, right? But there aren't usually the arguments that are brought against it by Christians or creationists in debates. So in having the confidence to just, openly talk about provisional knowledge that's meant to change, the self-correcting nature of an imperfect system, right? Because science is a man-made system, the scientific method and stuff. And being able to admit that there are, it's not perfect. It's not doling out facts. It doesn't prove things. Right. It is just, as you mentioned, or, because you mentioned methodological naturalism, I think that you and I could agree, just based on what you said, that it's just natural explanations for natural phenomena. Sure. So if we can agree with that, we can not only move forward with the conversation we're literally having in real time, but we can use it as an analogy for the suggestions that are kind of coming out of this.
Right. Because there's two levels of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
There's the conversation,
which I'm digging. It's like I'm trying to. I almost feel like I'm shifting in my chair as I'm like addressing each of the different levels. Like sure. This part of me likes the kid in me likes the sugar, while the adult in me likes the whole wheat.
So you guys are playing smooth jazz over there.
So, so I would say this, so you have the argument about the facts, right? Well, I've seen this rock layer and you've seen this rock layer, and then we have this argument about rock layers or whatever. And then there's like the noetics of the human mind and the capacity that people have to compute and think about these things, and I don't want to get like too deep into that, but what I wanted to point out was when talking about these things, obviously we all have a bias, right, at some point, but we need to. But what I'd like to do is, for example, I see this a lot. I see a lot of proofs, and people will come out with a proof, and then when somebody argues their proof, they'll get kind of defensive, and then they'll start like a match where you and I see. What I like to do is I like to say something more like, well, Chris, doesn't it stand to reason, blah, blah, blah. And then you can either go, no, I don't understand why you would say that, and we can move forward. But, it's interesting because I think Dr. Jordan Peterson makes a good point about this, is he says, if you're playing Monopoly, you and a friend, like me and you, or you and I are playing Monopoly. And I'm like, Monty, I've got Park Place and I've got all these buildings, man. Like, I'm destroying you. Like, and I've got all this money. Look at how much money I got. I'm just waving money. And then JD Kane comes in and he goes, so what? He just walks in the room. He's like, so what? You don't even really, that's not real property. And that's not even real money. It's like, we look at him, we're like, because he's not playing the same game as we are. So he's not in the same, he's not doing an internal critique. He's looking at it from outside and saying, no, you guys, it doesn't matter. You've got a flawed understanding of this money. But as Jordan Peterson points out, it's like, if you're not in on the game, like, you're going to be having a completely different conversation than the people who are inside of the actual atmosphere of the arguments. So I think you're right about that, because you were like, if we can agree on metaphysical naturalism, then we can move forward.
At first, you said metaphysical. I thought at the second point was methodological.
I'm sorry. I meant methodological. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I may have said that. I'm mistaken.
So
I meant methodological naturalism. If I wasn't clear about that.
Yeah.
So like
Like
if we,
our understanding starts to build the rules to the game that we're going to be playing.
right.
Like, but there's already kind of the shape of the conversation is going to change if we come into it, like I said earlier, like if you want to just own somebody, if you just want to just embarrass them and make them look stupid, if those are your goals, then these suggestions aren't necessarily for that.
And
style.
we both know there are shows like that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And
I
so,
mean,
so
I wouldn't name any names, but
right, no, definitely not. But I would just say that moving forward with the series, if you guys are going to do a series out of bad atheist arguments, and I would, definitely consider Christian. If I was Christians, I would say should consider doing a series on bad Christian or bad arguments for God. But moving forward, I would kind of categorize two separate categories of bad argument for atheists. Ones that I would call intellectual arguments, and then ones I would call pulling on heartstring arguments. So what we've been discussing is an intellectual argument, but I just wanted to distinguish that from the heartstring arguments, because there are those, right? But that goes into more, I think, what you were pointing out about some people aren't in it for those reasons. The reasons of getting to the bottom of things or trying to understand possibilities and increase their knowledge. And so, but I would think a lot of people on the intellectual side of things are grappling with these conversations and trying to understand. That's why my channel is called Converse Contender, because I want to be a contender in these conversations and not like Converse winner. Like I won, and no matter what you say, like I want to contend with people on these things. So I guess from there though,
just admitting that intellectually you might be struggling with a certain material. I mean, that if you were to admit that in a debate, right? So of course I'm going to fall back on a trope that I've said a million times, right? The tribalism. I know there's a certain inherent predisposition to engage in tribalism in humans, but I like to try to be as mindful of it as possible so that I don't make shitty decisions based on this bias that I know that I have. And I think that sometimes it gets ratcheted up, especially in YouTube debates or just in the YouTube community in general, right? So again, I think that those kinds of conversations will be the ones where people want to own each other, instead of having a conversation where the frame of the debate is, we're going to pick apart this topic because I want to understand why you think the way you think it, right? And I'm going to let you understand how I think. And there are some things we're going to agree on, like the definitions, which hopefully we're taking care of ahead of time. There are things that we're going to disagree about. And here's why we disagree with each other about it. Oh, I hold the consensus of experts in science and the current paradigms as the best temporary provisional knowledge base possible for natural explanations for natural phenomenon. And somebody might not. They might be like, oh, but look at all the crookedness in politics and getting peer-reviewed publications in, and p-hacking and all of, which are legitimate arguments if it wasn't used to score points in a tribalistic way, right? So getting back to you admitting that potentially people might be intellectually struggling with a concept or struggling with material, and if they bring it into a debate to pull apart with somebody who has a different approach than them, and they admit that they're struggling with it, I think that admitting that vulnerability would change the landscape of the debate itself, right? I'm not trying to turn debates into discussions, right? I
understand.
But I will admit that I have a bias towards discussions instead of debates. Debates don't solve anything.
I do too.
And debates kind of are held up as solving things in a way that I don't think is necessary. Whereas discussions aren't meant to solve anything. They're just making a connection and opening a door, right? So anyway, this isn't about discussions, even though this right now is a very good discussion.
Right.
It's a discussion about debates.
Yeah, sure. Well,
and arguments.
Right. Well, what I would say is, so when we think about the types of people who are involved in these discussions, and we look at creationism on a general scale, that a God created the universe and everything in it. Again, that's where I wanted to draw a distinction there between what everyone would accept as being true about nature, and then the explanation that it's something outside of nature that began it all, or is the cause of these things, or what have you. And I just wanted to point out that it seems to me, and a lot of the people who were the pioneers of science, obviously were Christians, and most of them believe in God, right? But what I want to point out about that is not that means that Christians are correct or anything like that, but rather, I think they were right about the book of God's Revelation, and then the book of nature. So they've seen it as you need to look at both and then derive what you believe from both. So, and then maybe this will help clarify what I mean by that is, if something is true, let's say evolution, some fact about the nature or science, if it's true and you're a believer, then it's true. God did it that way. It seems to me that a lot of times we hear something and then we go, well, it can't be true because it doesn't meet what I think about Scripture or whatever it may be. And regardless if what you think about Scripture, for example, if it's true about God. Like, God made it that way. So you have to check your interpretation at the door and then look at what God has actually done in this worldview, right? You have to look at what's actually been done, and then go to the Scriptures and say, okay, being that this is the way that the world is, and then look at it. Now, there could be, for example, you might say, well, why is there so many why is there diseases and stuff? God did this. And then you would look at Scripture and say, well, why is that? And then you would see the fall, for example, and go, oh, okay. So after the fall, God stepped back and things, kind of erupted on earth, tornadoes and whatnot, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to bring out the point that I think a lot of people get this wrong. You need to look at both. So sometimes it just seems to me like people who believe in God tend to, focus more on the Scriptures than what's actually in the world, like what God actually created, for example. So.
Yeah, and I think that people who debate creationists sometimes have a ham-fisted and inarticulate way of making their points. And I also think, and this can be chalked up into the kind of side conversation we're having, which is shitty atheist arguments.
Right.
Is debating against creationism is not an argument for atheism, right? And when I hear references that I can infer that is a point that's trying to be made, I think it's laughable, right? This is one of the reasons why, atheist arguments suck, is in general, most of them, look at this homemade pizza made by my son. These are the white pizzas.
The force for you, Chris.
Nice. Look at how awesome this is.
Awesome.
Made a white pizza. Looks awesome. now he's crawling on the floor to refill Shanna's Diet Pepsi.
Hi.
That's me. I get it.
Braylon, everybody.
That's another point of all this is I think sometimes these conversations aren't human. I mean, we're almost like robots sometimes. It's like that we can be having this conversation and then your family bust out laughing, and it's a human conversation, man. It's interesting. I feel like sometimes people are like robots. They're just no, look at this fact here, and then they just want to, at some point you have to appeal to, could you be wrong about that, or and then let's have a conversation like you and I are having, even if we're having a debate and I completely disagree with you, and I can still crack a joke or something like that, and we can have a more human conversation. Then I just think that you're a bad person. I see that a lot, not only in this debate, but in politics, for example, to, make somebody evil if they disagree with you, for example. And I think you're making a good point about proving creationism wrong being an argument for atheism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, admittedly, some creationists have genuinely horrible arguments, right? And going after that might be the low-hanging fruit and super fun. Some creationists might have more sophisticated and layered arguments, right? And that kind of leads towards just as with any debate, if you're going to actually take it seriously, do your homework, like understand where that person is coming from as best as you can, or what their stylistic choices are and stuff, right? And what their arguments are going to be in the face of, I'm sure, I'd like to think that nobody's like, oh, I have the argument that no one tried on Neff or Kent Hovind or someone like that. The point of doing the homework is to not reinvent the wheel. If you think an argument is really good, by doing your homework, you can see them. Thank you. You can see them respond to it as they were brought up by other people, and be prepared to counter argue the argument. Because I moderated a few debates, right? And I wasn't, as somebody who is an apatheist atheist, I wasn't satisfied with the performance of some of the people that were arguing against, that were arguing, I'm not going to say arguing for atheism, that would go against what I just said, that would be arguing against creationism. Some of them were just like insults. Like, I couldn't believe that this guy was just like, well, you're wrong and you're a fraud. And I was just like, that's not an argument. That, as a moderator, puts me in such a weird position. Like, that's an insult. That is not an argument. You can't, that is not counter. No, don't
that's
do
an
that.
ad hom, right?
Yeah. So, I don't know, where was I going with that?
So, I'll pick up on that. I think you're right about that. In that same debate with Kent Hovind and the other guy, sorry, I don't remember his name, but it seemed like they kept resorting to, since you don't buy my interpretation of Scripture, you just don't want to submit to the Scripture. So obviously, and it's just kind of like, well, does that follow? Because you have one and he has another, and you guys are both saying you don't accept mine, so obviously you're not submitting. That's kind of begging the question. And I think you're right about that, because sometimes it breaks down. But I just want to
get a quick point in based on what you just said, because this is a fun one for me. I actually think that having creationists making arguments that as scientists we consider anti-science, right? The language just seems anti-science, some of it, not all of it. But from a science communication perspective, I think it's a great thing to be challenged in such a way that you need to be able to justify why you're doing what you're doing. Okay, I'm using this version of the scientific method in this particular field. This is the best way to do it because it follows what maxims. Those maxims are good because, just being able to articulate it, I think, is a skill lacking in most scientists. I can tell you that. And I think that being challenged through these creationist arguments is a great opportunity to get comfortable talking about and justifying why, if you think that the scientific method is the gold standard, why? You can't just say it and have it be accepted.
So one thing I want to point out is that while I think there's a lot of bad arguments that are made, I think that and I know people are probably like, why don't y'all disagree already? I'm sure it makes for better footage, I'm sure. But what I would say is that there are some good arguments, but what I would say is it's more of the prediction argument. So, for example, I like Albert North Whitehead and other philosophers who pointed out, why didn't the scientific method arise in, the Orient, in China, or in Africa, or here or there? And then they go, well, there were, for example, algebra and other, related fields that popped up in different countries, but that was mainly due to, for example, trade. So like if there was, you're trading with other nations and on a large scale, you're trying to figure out, for example, okay, if I owe him 3 pennies back for this, then, and you're getting into mathematics and things like that. But the point that, why didn't anybody think about the world and say, oh, I bet you that there are fundamental laws that everything acts according to. And so I think that's a good point made by those philosophers, because they point out, well, on atheism, would you assume that everything was mapped out according to certain orderly principles, and so finely tuned in instead of saying, well, it's probably just random. Like I can see that argument that an early atheist who, before you know any science or any of this, you have this early mindset, and you would maybe be walking around the world looking, and you go, oh, a rock fell off a cliff, for example. You probably wouldn't think, I bet you every time it falls off a cliff, it accelerates at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? But to have that thought that I bet you that operates according to a certain law, for example, I think it was a good point that it makes sense if there's a lawgiver or like somebody who would specifically order it. So in that sense, it's kind of predictive. You predict, because there's somebody that's creating order, that there would be order, for example. So I think that's more of the argument that I would use, something like that, because it's not getting into the minutia and saying we disagree on the science, but rather it's just saying, hey, look, according to my worldview, like it's something that I would predict to be the case, for example.
Yeah, and if that was a problem for the person that you were, scheduling a debate with, then maybe the debate should be about worldview. If the person feels strong enough in talking about like the psychology of belief formation, which would be delicious. And the developmental theories of faith that exist, and and while not accusing the person of having a wrong worldview, explain why. Your worldview is yours. I think differently. Here's why I think the way that I think. Right? It's not based in biblical things. Also, not only are these anecdotes, but I'm going to kind of put before you psychological evidence, right? The psychology of belief formation, how knowledge forms, what we think we know, the developmental theories of Fowler's developmental theories of faith. Like, there's pieces of evidence that just might be compelling to somebody and influence their worldview, that by saying it out loud and saying, this is why I think the way that I do. And if the two of you can't get past the worldview thing to get to a point where you're not just perpetually going to land on worldview arguments, something you already agreed to disagree about, then maybe that's not the right person to be debating with, or
Sure.
It might not be the right topic. But I know
Yes.
people get sick of the worldview thing. So in the same sense, and I think
Sure.
that the worldview thing kind of, I don't remember hearing it as much with the Ken Hams and Kent Hovens of the evidentialist proselytizing when I was getting into that. It kind of became more popular after the presup argument came about. So speaking of presup, I also want to say that in the same way, I think that creationist arguments are good for people that are fans of science or scientists or believers in science or people who trust science, however you want to phrase it. Mm-hmm. That it's good for them to get used to explaining why they think what they think. I think that presuppositionalism, as much as I disagree with it, put atheists on their back heels, because their wheelhouse was this body of evidentialist arguments that websites were dedicated to. And then somebody starts getting philosophical on them, and they don't know what to do. And then philosophy became fetishized and weaponized. But I do think that to a certain degree, it's good to be able to know just enough as a layperson to kind of understand the kinds of arguments that should somebody shift to a more philosophical mode. I think it's a good thing for people that are supporting their faith to be challenged in that way. Again, totally disagreeing with the argument itself, the content. But
yeah, I agree with you, but to a certain point. Like, so So
That's damn good
because we want to hear, because we want to talk about predictability, right? And so we want to think about some of these things, and we want to say, for example, okay, why did people become scientific around this certain point? Well, it's because they started reading into the scriptures and then seeing things like the heavens declare the glory of God, and so on and so forth. And excuse me, as I believe it was Kepler that pointed out, I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. So he's like looking for, like, I wonder how God did it. And like, so anyway, I know you're going to disagree with some of that stuff, of course, but I did want to make another point, though. A side point is that, so I hear with young Earth creationists a couple of bad arguments. One being, well, you guys are just looking at the evidence that's, science is, you're just looking at modern day science and then taking that and then reading it into the text, for example. But I would just point out that people like St. Augustine, as far back as the 4th century, I believe he was in the 300s. I could be wrong, but I'm thinking that's correct. He pointed out that he thought that the days of Genesis weren't literal 24-hour days. He says they could. He says it's potential that they're not, for example. And then he had an argument, which I don't think is a great argument, but he said something like, because the sun wasn't made till the 4th day. Now, I don't think that's a great argument, but at least it shows that people were already thinking about this before there's any type of modern developments or anything. Like, it's not some type of new thing we're trying to put on the scriptures, but rather we're looking at God's revelation through nature, right? And then we're applying them. So, I mean, I don't know if that's something that you even wouldn't want to comment on, but I'm just pointing out that that's not a necessarily a modern thing, but I think it's a bad argument from the young Earth side of things.
Interesting. So I'm just going to try to paraphrase what you said. The arguing against being too rigid in your interpretation of the Bible, such that your creationism is inflexible and not able to look at other scholars that have looked at the same topic and come up with a different result. It kind of sounds like that's the rub for you, that they might be doing themselves no favors by ignoring that.
Yeah, and I hear Kent Hovind and a lot of these other guys say this all the time. They'll go, "Well, if an 8-year-old read it, would he get what you got out of it?" And I would just point out, like, that's a terrible argument, because, like, I actually have an 8-year-old. Like, like my son's 8-year-old. Awesome. I'm like, you think that my son is going to look at the book of Ezekiel and understand it? Like, it's just not a good argument. He's, you don't put it up to their standards and go, well, if they read it, they'd get what I got out of it. Okay, is that an argument for your view? I don't think so.
And I also argument. So pivoting off of that a little bit. Go ahead. Sometimes what I'll hear. Okay, so at strict adherence to a creationist interpretation, a 6,000 to 10,000 year creationist version that is being spoken about by evidentialist apologetists. I think that it can lead you towards things that, if you're trying to prove it scientifically, which sometimes they do, which unfortunately from our perspective just looks like an attempt to have a veneer of science to fool just enough people that you know what you're talking about, while not necessarily pulling the wool over the eyes of the people that do know what you're talking about. But if the purpose of a debate is entertainment and winning and being persuasive, then those kinds of things work. The mistake is, hold on a second, that was a super long ramp up to a point.
Oh, brevity's not my strong suit either.
Yeah, good. I'm not alone. Is the idea that, there's an idea in science communication called the deficit model. And it kind of goes like this. So this would be from, I'm always going to take on the position. I'm not always. In this instance, I'm going to take on the position of the atheist, right? Oh, you think that is justified scientifically? Well, you're wrong, because you just don't understand the fundamental and foundational knowledge that is required to understand that. Let me teach it to you. That is as intuitive as it is, it's like, oh, they just don't get it. Let me explain it to them. And then once they re-look at it, reappraise it through this filter of correct information, they'll see what I'm talking about. Right? It's instinctive and reflexive to think that that is a persuasive way of getting a point across, especially in something as complex as like science. And the science of science communication has demonstrated how ineffective it is. It is like the worst way to approach it, because you're essentially saying you're wrong and I'm going to teach you how to get right. You know, like not everybody, not everybody in the conversation grants you as an educator in that capacity.
Right. You're an authority to them. So that's a good point. I make this point, for example, in a different way. Many of, like, if you check out some of the material I have on my channel, for example, I was on the Scholar Fiction show the other night, and then I've been on other shows where I've said the same thing. Is that, you know, when I look at the evidence for people being confronted with different beliefs, it says when you confront someone with a belief that contradicts their beliefs explicitly, they cling tighter to their beliefs, or at least they tend to. People tend to. So I guess if you, like, what your point is that, hey, you think you're going to come as an authority to this person and be like, well, I'll explain, like, because while I get what you're saying, that that's a bad atheist argument, I think there's the counterpart to that where, you know, creationists try to look at specifics in fields, like different specific fields, and then try to derive from having some little knowledge about something to therefore God exists. Like, well, hold on, wait a second. Let me explain to you about nucleic acids or whatever. And then they end up coming to the conclusion that, see, God created it. And I'm like, well, that could have, you know, I at least know that could have, you know, that's a natural process, for example. But I think your point's correct too, that on the other side, when you go, no, they just don't understand it because of how they don't know as much. You know, although I'm not a presuppositionalist, I think Saitin Bruggencate makes a good point about this, where he goes, when an atheist and a believer looks at rock layers, or looks at a fossil, for example, one of them goes, oh yeah, look at that fossil, millions of years, and the other looks at it and goes, no, thousands of years. And I'm generalizing creationists to the younger view, obviously, but he says something like, we're gonna, you know, look at things according to what we already have preconceived notions, for example. That's his whole spiel, right? But for example, and he gives one more point that I just wanted to add, and then I'll shut up. But he says, if it was true that Adam, you know, was born the way young Earth creationists think Adam was born, as, you know, a grown man, for example, or at least, you know, an older man that's able to communicate with God and so on and so forth. When he was born, how old was he? Well, he was 1 second old, but he had the appearance of, you know, that he looked like he was, you know, 30 years old or whatever. So I think it's a good point. And of course, I don't take that line of thought there, but I just wanted to point out that I think the point that you're making is made by apologists, actually. Like, you're not going to go to somebody and then go, yeah, but look at this fossil, and like the way I'm, you know, look at the science behind the fossil, and then convince them. Like, they're just going to stick to their view most of the time, I would think.
I agree. Would it be okay if I invited Tony in? Even if we're just going to hang for another whatever minutes?
Do whatever.
Okay.
It's up to
Can you
JD.
take care of that?
Yeah, that's fine.
I was going to say something that we were talking about earlier.
And if you got,
Go ahead.
if you guys want to challenge me on anything as well, that's fine. I mean, we've been agreeing for the most part, but I know we do disagree, but we're talking about bad atheist arguments. And sometimes I take that, and then I want to bring up the bad creationist arguments.
I think it's refreshing.
Sorry.
It's refreshing to hear what you consider bad arguments on your team. Right?
Yeah, I almost feel like I'm trying to balance the scale.
Yeah, my wife is right next to me. She's a deist, Shanna, and she and I were literally having a conversation about bad atheist arguments. Oh, so you brought up the worldview one, the Ken Ham one. I think that a mistake that atheists make is that the atheist position is the neutral ground from which everyone needs to support
It's
shit.
the default position.
Yeah,
It's
I
the
do.
default
I
position.
think that's lazy as fuck.
The default position. Man.
Default position. That's exactly what he said. Excuse me. So it's just
I agree with
arbitrary. It's arbitrary and entitled.
I agree with you. It's like, hey, look, well, everything's natural. So obviously naturalism's the case. Like, what? Or at least we should start with that. Like, I can understand like methodological naturalism and saying, hey, look, to look at natural things.
It's a tool, right? It
Yeah,
is a tool, and the rule book for this particular tool, which doesn't answer everything, is that it is to be used to attempt to unlock. Oh, I forgot what the fuck I was saying. Naturalistic explanations to natural phenomena. I'm sorry, I can't read and talk at the same time.
No, yeah, I agree. So I would just say that, like, sometimes when we try to look at supernatural, we try to explore the supernatural realm, for example, with naturalistic, methods, for example, like when they did the studies on prayer. It's like, well, hold on a second, the people that were praying for a certain result, and so on and so forth. There are all these arguments that show that it was at least biased, for example. And like most of the groups were Catholic, for example. There are many things that went into it, and it didn't account for, like, are there other people praying for these people and their families, and so on. So there's just so many factors that you can't. So what I would say is, yes, we should explore the natural with naturalistic methods. Like, it just seems common sense to me. And I know we agree on that. So, I mean,
and as a reminder of how, like, admittedly, I sound, to my detractors, I just sound like a wishy-washy, on the fence, whatever. But like I mentioned, I'm more apathetic to the argument of arguments for or against God concepts. I'm more apathetic towards them than I am activist in any way, shape, or form for atheism. But if you gave me a two alternative forced choice question, where I had to pick, theist or atheist, I would choose atheist.
right. Well,
so that makes it a little.
You should be destroying me by now.
Destroying.
You know that.
Obliterating. Like
yeah,
all those
you should have already been.
posts. Yeah.
Right. What's
There's
up, Tony
Tony.
Reed?
Howdy.
All right. So, Tony, real quick, let everybody know the name of your YouTube channel.
You're on mute, I
Call-
think. Are you guys able to hear him?
He's robotic to me.
I'm not able to hear him at all.
No, you're still robotic.
No, it's
choppy.
I'm not
mess.
hearing anything.
Yeah, it's breaking up terribly. We can't really understand anything.
I haven't heard a single thing so far.
So I tried to mention it at the top. Hopefully I get it right this time. How Creationism Taught Me Real Science is a series that he has on his channel. His channel might just be his name, Tony Reed. That's REED.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing his. I'm interested in hearing his arguments, because I haven't, considered them, obviously. But I like the point that you made, though, about this trope that atheism is the default position. I mean, I just got to agree with you, obviously, that it's usually that claim, but then it's backed up by, like, naturalism. It's usually like what I pointed out. We should study the natural, just like with natural things, like with science. And but that's not necessarily atheism. That's just methodological naturalism, like I pointed out at the beginning.
Yeah, that you're leaning towards a naturalistic philosophy, right? And natural philosophy was the predecessor to science. So, like in the history of science, it makes sense that if you have a philosophy about nature and you're using natural explanations for natural phenomena, that makes perfect sense. I just think it's being taken too far, and I'll be the first to admit that I've used this argument where you're like, hey, under every rock, you just find more nature. Like that's a fun argument to make, and if you place it well, it really does land as a gotcha moment, but it's completely cotton candy fluff.
Right.
There's nothing to it.
What's up,
Tony, let's try your mic.
How do I sound?
You sound great. Sexy.
Okay.
Even.
Oh, come on now.
All right. So how creationism taught me real science. Did I get it right that time?
That's the name of the show. Yeah. Essentially, I just take the creationist argument and I then present the science. And I mean, it doesn't always end up being parallel to the creationist arguments, but either way, that's just how it works.
And so tell me a little bit, like, why, when you debated Neff, was that your first debate with a creationist?
That was actually probably my fourth. I've debated Kent Hovind, I've debated Neff, and then two other people that are not really very notable. But and Nephilim Free, the thing about him is his arguments, you really don't. You were talking about this preordained idea of how people are going to argue. You never know what he's going to pull out.
Oh, because he has resources in front of him. He has like drop menus of like the info. Oh, on this topic, this subtopic, bam, this is the argument, bam. Like or something. Because you can hear him clicking away before he does it. But I mean, more power to him. He's prepared.
Yeah. The thing is, we've had a lot of debate after that, because if you remember in that debate, he'd presented his sources afterward. And, we had a little written debate where I showed him that his sources didn't agree with him, but he didn't care. And that's actually been the history of my debate with him. Just in the written form, his sources never agree with him.
So we could get into that as well, right? Like, what would be the value? And so the question that I would ask is, what would be the value in showing that person, or at least, not any individual, but somebody who has been known to, in the face of counter evidence, just hold true to a talking point? What would be the value in trying to show that their interpretation of it is incorrect? To a greater question, which is there a way to circumvent that kind of rope-a-dope? Because once you start trying to get into those details, once you're in the weeds, you're playing the game in their terms, from my perspective.
I would agree with you there. But the thing is, I don't debate him because of him. He's never going to change. Okay. There are people that watch the debate, and the people that watch the debate and perhaps follow up on things, they're the ones that I really care about. And Nephilim Free, I mean, I'm not going to talk bad about the guy, but the guy's got problems, and he doesn't really represent even the creationist perspective very well.
So I have a question. Since you debated four people, two of which were Neff and Kent, how did they compare to the other two people? Like, if you had to rank them as far as difficulty.
Well, I've actually had a debate since then. The last one was a guy who he reminded me of the Sunday school creationist. He was a youth group, more specifically creationist. He was very nice, very polite, very friendly, and very graceful. Nephilim Free, even afterwards, was very graceful. Kent Hovind.
Full disclosure, I get along great with Neff. I just want
he's not. I don't get along with him in written terms, but personally, we got along fine. Kent Hovind, on the other hand, man, he is such a douche as a person. I mean, that's not an argument against his arguments. As a person, he is unpleasant. I found him to be unpleasant. The other two guys that I talked to were, again, just like the Sunday school youth group creationists. They didn't really show up armed for the argument. What I noticed was common about all of them is none of them could stick to the topic. And so that's, I mean, I think this is about, I thought this discussion was about debating a creationist specifically. And if I was to give advice to anybody, is make sure they stay on topic. It's hard to do it because they can't help but go off topic, but that is what they do.
Well, I'll just say that since Nephilim was brought up, I actually like Nephilim Free, but I haven't talked to him in years. But we used to talk back in the G+ days all the time. So, but obviously we disagree on things, right? But I would put Nephilim Free in the category of at least being. I would put him in the category of like not being dishonest. There are people who are just dishonest, right? That it's just unfruitful to even have discussions with them. Now, Nephilim Free he'll argue for his position, and he'll go to sources and things, and then you guys can disagree about him. I'm not trained enough, or I haven't specialized in any field of science where I would go to it and try to break down every little detail, every fact. So that's not my position. Like, that's not how I try to do it. Rather, what I try to do is I try to appeal to, okay, well, what does the science say? And then you tell me, and then let's talk about it, right? And then I try to break it down from there. Okay, how does that negate God? What are the implications of those of this evidence? Does it lead to what you're leading to? But as Tony pointed out, sometimes it does jump around, and it doesn't stay on topic, and I can agree with him on that.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's a purposeful move with everybody. I'd like to,
Sure.
I'd love to. This is naive optimism. JD has chastised me about this. My naive optimism, that is, about people on the Googles. I don't think that they're purposely doing it to rope-a-dope. I think that their understanding of it includes all of these disparate points that I think from their perspective are grains of sand making a mountain. So since it's all in the same mountain, they can jump from grain of sand to grain of sand, right? And so from them, they're staying on topic because the topic of conversation is this mountain. That mountain is supported by all these different things from my perspective that from your perspective look like I'm jumping around all over the place because you see the mountain differently.
Right. It might be a tangent. It could be a tangential point. So you go off on a tangent to bring it back in. Sometimes I do that because it may be because ADHD, or maybe because,
I did it 3 times tonight while we were talking.
Right. I mean, I do that. Like, it's just it's how my mind works. It's, so I won't fault somebody for that as long as it's a tangential point. As long as you bring it back around at some point.
Yeah.
To
as
what
long as
we
you
were
land the
talking
plane.
about.
If you land the plane, take it off. Go.
Right. No, we're just not.
Well,
we're not going to just fly until we run out of gas. I mean.
Well,
ahead.
some of these.
What do you say about that, Tony?
Well, I mean, as far as, well, first of all, I don't agree that Nephilim Free is honest because when he cites his sources, but they don't say what he says they do, and when you show them that, he changes the subject to, you can deny things all you want, but blah blah blah, and that's not completely. I don't feel he's honest. I do feel Kent Hovind is honest. I'm surprised that I feel that way, because
the other way.
Yeah, I thought he was dishonest at first, but then I debated him, and I realized this guy actually believes his stuff. He really has no concept.
Well, Tony, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, interrupt.
Well, the other thing I was going to say about the tangent, though, is I have noticed, and you would be you Converse Contender, you'd probably be the best person to enlighten me on this. It seems that creationists tend to make creationism synonymous with Christianity, and specifically the Bible in general has to be true, or it can only be true if creationism is true. And so when like, for example, a gentleman I debated, nice enough kid, but when we were debating creationism, he started bringing up cities that we found that were mentioned in the Bible. And I'm thinking that has nothing to do with flood geology. It has nothing to do with creation. That has to do with those particular cities. But, for him, if creationism, the Bible is one single work for him, and it might be for you too, but it surprised me to see that he couldn't stick to the subject of creationism and rather made it broader towards Christianity. And just so you know, not a Christian. I would call myself an atheist, or even better, an apatheist. I have no interest in converting somebody away from creationism or, Christianity. Creationism, I'm happy if you believe it, just don't call it science. But I'd love to hear your explanation of that kind of making synonymous the creationism and the entire Bible.
Well, there's a few points I'd like to make. One, you said something like about the Bible being one work or something, and I just point out that a lot of people look at the Bible as a book when it's a library of sources from the ancient world. So, like, I just wanted to make that point up front so we could understand what we're talking about, right? But your question seemed to be, why do Christians look at creationism only through the lens that it can only be true by the lens of Christianity. But correct me if I'm wrong. Go ahead and maybe you could rephrase it as well if that's not an accurate portrayal.
It's almost accurate. I don't
Okay.
mean Christians, because plenty of Christians accept evolution.
Sure.
Lots of them do. In fact,
I
most
do.
people who accept evolution are in fact Christians. Most people who are creationists happen to be Muslims or Hindus, but in this case, Christian creationists, that particular group, tends to make creationism and the entire Bible synonymous.
Well, okay. Well, let me point out one more thing, that because we kind of defined our terms on this at the beginning, but you're just coming in. So,
And I want to make a point when you're done. So if you don't
Yeah.
mind throwing it to me.
so yeah, sure. So Tony, you said, well, these creationists, they assume that not everybody, like there aren't people like you who accept evolution. The creationists, obviously don't. But what I'll point out is I don't. So we defined early on what creation was. So if you mean by creation is just that God created everything, or do you mean like that at some point God did it in the way the younger creationists look at it? Because even if I accept evolution, which I do for the most part, I mean there are different portions in it which I think need to be updated. I would just say look at just this is a side note, but just look at David Gleringer and David Berlinski and a few others had a talk recently on the Hoover Institution about, and they're obviously scientists that know the field, but they had a talk about the research. Now, so I would say I do accept it, but you almost pinned it as if creationist is one category and people who accept evolution in another. I just wanted to clarify there. Is that what you meant to do? And then I'll address your question.
Okay, well, I guess you guys, I didn't realize that you guys had defined creationism. I've actually been watching the whole thing. I didn't realize you guys had defined creationism thusly. I have had a number of people come onto my channel and comment on the definition of creationism, and they defined it as you do. But when I asked for the actual definition, they would provide a dictionary definition. And here was the issue I had with it. The definition they presented was the belief that the entire universe and all of life on Earth was specially created by a particular deity, as opposed to natural processes.
Gotcha.
And so that can include old Earth creationism. That can include young Earth creationism. But since it uses the words "as opposed to," I mean, if it said in tandem with, or potentially just not even ending it with that, just was created by God, that would be a different definition of evolution, of creationism that I've seen. I am not using that definition that you're using for creationism.
That's what I just wanted to make
So hold on a second. JD, make a note. We should make a community called like the Great Debate Creationists, like the GDC for short, and we should spend most of our time on definitions of creationism. How's that sound?
That sounds like deja vu, honestly.
What do you mean deja vu? From somebody did that already?
Yeah, it was something similar. It was close, maybe.
Okay. All right.
If memory serves.
Yeah. Well,
So,
maybe
so Tony, if I, so I wanted, that's why I wanted to find out, like, what did you mean by that? Right. So if I were to respond to what you meant from what I was accepting as what I thought you meant, I might have done it in a rather an unintentionally dishonest way. So let me just say this: if the reason why I think people do this is because, number one, they want to they look at Christianity as a foundation. So they're not going to deny their foundation and then go, all right, well, let's look at science and let it lead to the Bible. So, and that makes sense in philosophy, that you have a foundation, for example, and then you build layers upon that, and you get, you don't arrive at the conclusion of Christianity, but rather you look at it through a lens. And while there are certain faults to that, there are also certain benefits to that as well, so that a lot of people who start with the conclusion and try to work toward a foundation, they have other problems as well. So they're and then we get into Agrippa's trilemma, and I know you don't want to go all the way down that road, but I'm just saying that's why I believe they do it, is because they're like, hey, we start with our foundation, and then we build upon it the knowledge that we have coming in. And specifically Christianity, because you're starting with a starting point. So I think that's why they do that. And
It's interesting to me.
Hold on, I want to get in real quick.
Sorry.
Like, my turn. Wait, me. Let's argue about whose turn it is. I'll be the first arguing of the broadcast. So sometimes, like the very thing that the two of you are talking about, right? Tony, you kind of brought up a problem with the references, the perpetual references to God in a creationist debate, or a debate about creationism, or the scientific merits of creationist claims, however you want to frame it. And then Converse. So do you go by anything else other than Converse Contender?
People just call me Converse most of the time. Yeah.
Very good. Converse it is.
My name's Will, so like if you guys wanted to call me, that's fine. It's just most people.
I think I'll call you Will if you don't mind.
That's fine. No problem.
Excellent. Thank you. Will was talking about like there are advantages and disadvantages from starting from a biblical position, and either using that as a conclusion to look for foundations, or using it as a framework within which to look at scientific. I think that that's an interesting discussion, because there are going to be cases where at the very core of the person that you're talking to, they're more interested in proselytizing, right? And sometimes they'll get to the very end of the debate, and that's when they'll bust it out. Sci-10 Atheist was good at this, because when he'd get cornered philosophically, he'd be like, listen, I'm not here to argue philosophy with you. I'm just concerned for your soul, in the same way that I'd be concerned of watching a friend walk off a cliff. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
And then Kent Hovind kind of does a very similar thing, where he's like, hey, listen, you can believe what you want, but what's in the textbooks is what I presented, and it's all wrong. And, that makes evolution a religion. And if you're going to make it a religion, then it can't be taught in the public schools. And an argument, like the core of his argument is what is being taught in schools. That's why he uses textbooks to get to his points, right? So you can circumvent all of his shitty arguments, from our perspective, shitty arguments, and just ask him about that. Like, so let's cut to the chase. Are you concerned for my soul? All right. So let's talk about proselytizing. Let's talk about the way that you can get to me, because the method that you're using ain't gonna work, right? Or whatever could come from that kind of discussion. It might be valuable to just determine ahead of time of whether, like, what is this? Are these claims that you're willing to? Are these claims that you're making a hill you're willing to die on, or are you just struggling with them intellectually and you want to hash them out, or are you just using them as bait to trap me into proselytizing about being concerned about my soul at the end, right? And hopefully they'd be honest with you and be like, well, of course I'm concerned for your soul, and blah 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 blah. And maybe that could be the framing of the conversation. I don't know. What were you going to say earlier, Tony? I just wanted to get that one point in.
Well, now it seems kind of pointless, but I was going to bring up something about the idea that you have to have a scientific foundation for your belief, for your Christian belief. I mean, and I hate to quote the Bible, but I mean, Jesus did in fact say to Thomas, "You've seen me, and therefore you believe. But blessed is he who hasn't seen and yet believes." So why do you even need science to be a Christian? You don't have to have a scientific basis for your belief. I'm absolutely fine with anybody who says they believe something, and I'd love to hear about their beliefs. In fact, I don't even mind if they try to convert
on you. Yeah, could I turn that around to atheist arguments? Do atheists need a scientific foundation to come to their conclusions?
No.
Yeah, so I don't think that people argue we need a scientific explanation to believe in God, but rather Christ said things like also beware. He said stuff like beware of false teachers. He said the Bible also says test all things. It says false prophets will come to you in sheep's clothing, but they're wolves. So like be aware, like you need to test things. So I would say that's another principle in the Bible. That's hey, check out the world. Like, but I can agree. Go ahead.
Well, that is true, but keep in mind that the vast majority of science is about prediction, and generally, basically, it's based on this hypothesis. If we're accepting this theory to be true, when we perform this experiment, I expect to see this result. Then you go and perform that experiment, and if you see that result, I mean, I hate to use the word prophecy, but you've prophesized what was going to happen. And that is what science does. It predicts the evidence before we find it. And so again, I don't see how that's a false prophet. That's quite the opposite. That is, I mean, when you don't find what you expect to find, you change your theory. That's what the scientific method demands you do.
Right. And that's why I think a lot of Christians, I don't want to say most because I don't know the research, but that's why I think of a lot of Christians and other people who believe in God accept evolution fine, because they look at what's created and they do what I do, and they go, well, if it's a fact, then God did it that way. Like, it just makes sense. And so I need to look at what I'm looking at and say, well, hold on a second. These people, like, for example, in Genesis, did they write it this way because they're an oral culture and it wasn't written down when they first said it, and they used it like for example, there's a correlation between the days that the air was, like the days that the water was created and the days that the things that dwell in the water were created, for example, and then on with the sky and the birds and things like that. So but the other point I wanted to make was I don't think it's clear though that people need to have a scientific explanation, but rather we want to look at the world around us. So science doesn't lead to God. And I think you might have taken me the wrong way when I said Christ told us to challenge things and test things and beware of false prophets and things like this. So, keep your critical skills in order. He didn't mean that like, I don't know. It just seemed like you misunderstood me on that. Maybe you can rephrase your argument.
I probably did misunderstand you because, I mean, you don't really represent the creationists. I mean, sure. Not one of us here, as far as I know, is a creationist. So none of us is really properly armed to represent the creationist position. It has been my experience in debating creationists that they do question the science, but they question it by reading talking points, usually off of websites, instead of actually, looking at the sources that those websites present. And I'm not trying to shill for my show. I promise you, I'm not. But one of the things about my show, I'm not shilling for my show.
Shill away.
I don't like watching people shill for their show. But one of the things that I do is I read the arguments and I read the sources that creationists present. And oftentimes they do present sources, which is wonderful because then I read their sources. And the sources almost never say what they say they are, what they're claiming. And that's where the argument comes. And you don't represent that group. So I can't expect you to answer for that.
So I guess what I would say then, and I think you're correct, but what I would say is that, so creationists, and you're using the term as in young earth creationists. So, because I believe, for example, that God created all things, but your term, you're in your sense, the creationists, they don't seem to disagree, for example, that things tend to drop at a known rate, 9.8 meters per second squared. They tend to take things that are more specified or specialized fields that are difficult to understand. And then also they tend to take things that people in the scientific community have to extrapolate from. And not saying that they're wrong to extrapolate from these things, but I'm just saying you take one thing, like, for example, the evidence for like a whale-like to cow-like, a cow-like to whale-like being, right? And you look at the evidence for it, and then you have to extrapolate that due to the evidence we have, this transition actually occurred, and so on and so forth. And then they look at those things, and I think because sometimes they use what's difficult to understand, but the other point is, they don't really disagree on things like known rates of gravity, the speed of light, like things like this, until you get into obviously flat Earth beliefs and stuff. But that doesn't represent the Christian, as
Anything. It doesn't
yeah,
represent anything.
right. So, but you get my point though, that they don't disagree on things that are pretty plain in science. It tends to just be things that are specialized fields, for example, the really hard details that you need to specialize in something to understand.
And even if we take it out of these specialized fields, I mean, that the results of scientific study are underdetermined, right? Getting into the philosophy of science means that it doesn't necessarily, the theory that was used to frame the study and to come to the prediction, the support of this theory, or the support of the null hypothesis, right? The results could be framed differently within science. People have competing ideas of why things happen. So when somebody does a study and it shows this, and they come to this conclusion, all it takes is a different lab that looks at it differently to get the same exact results with the same exact methods, but their explanation is different. So it's not just, I mean, even in my lab, we redid a study that had to do with propylene glycol exposure. This is what I had I had sent you a link to this, JD, back when in the Google Plus days, talking about vaping, because propylene glycol was the main matrix used in vaping. And I said, I don't know about the flavors, but there's no harm in propylene glycol inhalation, right? Because we did this study. Previous research had shown that it was actually harmful, right? But because we did a study based on the way we understood things, and because we did things in what we consider obviously a more methodical way, we were able to critique the methods of that paper in order to critique and reframe their conclusion such that it was the opposite of what they said, right? So even all of this as an example of, even within science, within specific fields, if you're looking at something differently, that is a legit thing to do, because even though the purpose of hypotheses is to predict, what it predicts, and should it come true, does not do anything other than support that hypothesis, right? You get to reject the null hypothesis. It might also support other hypotheses. But that's why it's underdetermined. It doesn't specifically determine that the theory it was generated from, the results support just and only mutually exclusive that theory. So it is a legit move. Of course, it seems sneaky from our perspective, but it's a legit move to be like, okay, those were the conclusions, and I understand how it makes sense in this framework, but from this framework, it looks different.
Well, we talked. You guys talked earlier about explanations and how things are explained, and it's very easy to explain anything. You can explain anything from any point of view, really, if you have the creativity. And so one of those things you were talking about, things that are extrapolated, like, for example, the whale, the land mammal to whale. And you're right. In and of itself, that is an extrapolation, and it may go too far, except for the fact that it actually predicts exactly where we find particular fossils in particular strata, in particular geographical locations. So, but to getting back to Chris's point, though, you're right. It doesn't prove well, it proves the hypothesis correct. It does not prove the theory correct. You're absolutely right.
It doesn't prove the hypothesis correct. It supports the hypothesis.
Because Isaac Newton, he made some predictions that were true, but his method by which he came about those was obviously wrong. We accept the general relativity. And so I get your point, though, that, like, hey, at least it's got some predictive power, right? It has explanatory power as well, because it explains a lot of what's going on, the scope of it as well. So I get your point, obviously, but I would just have to say that I think that's what they're resting on, is that it is not what. So they would call it an extrapolation, for example. They wouldn't say that it was the same as gravity or the same as, other laws of gravity or things like that we know in science to a mathematical degree. They would just say that, hey, at some point you got to look at this and extrapolate, and we got to accept what you're saying. But I don't know. I guess that we don't disagree on that. I'm sure that you probably don't disagree with what I said there. But one point I do want to make, though, is that as much as it's funny how this works, but as much as we want to talk about bad atheist arguments, sometimes I find myself like agreeing with you guys, like, hey, we end up talking about how creationist arguments are bad, and we kind of fade that way, and I'll go right along with it because I don't disagree with a lot of what you guys are saying. But I would just point out that in the same way that there's places where you have to extrapolate. I think that a lot of creationists rely on they say that they don't like that science changes. So they'll say something like, oh yeah, well, aerosol cans used to be bad for the ozone and things like this. And then they'll extrapolate that to go, so therefore, how can we trust what scientists are saying? And, and then atheists will point out that, no, they're extrapolating from one thing to the other. Like there's no, link there, obviously. So I'm just pointing out that I think some of this works on both ways, which I'm sure you would probably agree with. But
I think all of these work both ways. They just look different when they're coming from each of the directions, right? Like I would say, in this is just me speaking. I would say in the same sense that, from my perspective, creationists don't get science right because they don't have the foundational knowledge. They could easily claim that any statement I make about the Bible is, I'm sure the kids are going nuts over kids. My anything that I say about the Bible is, from their perspective, like, oh, you lack foundational knowledge to truly understand what it is, the thing that you're saying. I think it goes both ways. And that's why I think it's important to at least have laid out a laser sharp topic. And, of course, it would be impossible to talk about, like, okay, and what tangential things what analogies can we use, to make our points? That's kind of splitting hairs to an unproductive point. But, I mean, if it's just going to come down to man first versus God first, then debate that, right? Instead of like jumping through hoops to just get to the point where, oh, the thing that we disagree about is your philosophy subsumes mine because God first, and my philosophy subsumes yours because man first, right? Because those seem to be where the arguments break down to. Those seem to be where the crossroads are. That's where your finger is on the pulse of the difference that you have. Because from that perspective,
right,
reality is shaped.
Yeah, I agree with you and I would just say that most of these arguments for naturalism or nature, any of these arguments, they don't negate God. So I would just, it seems like it's just people arguing their limited knowledge about science. So I mean, in a sense, I can see where you're coming from. That even if everything you believe about, modern day science is exactly right, and quantum physics and all the other things aren't going to change us in the next 100 years into something totally unrelated to what we believe is true today in the scientific community, let's say. Even if all that's true, it doesn't negate God, obviously. So, I mean,
breaking something down is not building something else up.
Right. And you know what? That's an interesting phrase, because Gary Vaynerchuk, I'm not sure if you guys know him, but he actually uses that. He goes, I'd rather build the biggest building in town rather than destroy all the other ones so that my small building looks big, right? And Tony, I think that's a good point.
What do you think about that idea that, breaking down an argument is not the same as building one up?
Well, I obviously already agree with that. I mean, that's not what I ever attempt to do, except in the argument or the debate that you moderated with myself and Nephilim Free. The point of it was, what are the practical applications? And if you'll recall, when I began that debate, I began by conceding, for the sake of argument, that creationism is 100% true, that evolution is 100% wrong. And even if that is true, that evolution is wrong, it still has practical application. And that even if creationism is correct, it has no practical application.
Now,
and
that is risky. That is a ballsy move, right? Which could totally work, right? I think that it was brilliant when I heard it. My fear was you being able to maintain center, because the arguments against the very nuanced thing that you're trying to do they seem insulting. And as soon as you're insulted, you have gone from your cold emotional state where you can thread that fucking needle that is beautiful, right? Like, I concede everything. Pragmatically, it has use. It's utile. Here's all the things that it's useful for, even if it's an as-if theory. I'm paraphrasing what I heard. Is that a fair assessment?
That I didn't think about it from the insulting point of view, but yeah.
Well, only because it seems insulting. I don't think I don't always think they're meant as insults, but as soon as you're insulted, you're knocked off center, and your ability to cold state logic these things becomes a hot state where, like, they got the best of you, right? And what I saw from that debate was you getting your goat gotten, and it having an effect on your performance. I might be
getting my goat gotten.
Yeah, not because he was crushing you with arguments, but he has a gish gallop. He talks for long periods of time. He says a lot of fallacies in a short period of time, and it put you back on your heels. Now, again, I don't think he said anything that was like, you're an asshole. Like, he wasn't insulting you personally, but sometimes the way he frames, like, oh, well, maybe you just have a misunderstanding of, or just like the way he goes into his arguments can be insulting. And I'll happily take on board that maybe they didn't affect you in the way that I was perceiving it, but I certainly did see you. I did see your ability to maintain center kind of deconstruct as the debate went on. From my perspective.
I could see that. I could see that you probably looked that way. It was really more that I was shocked that he made the arguments he made. When he did that entire list of scientists looking at things that we see in nature, and then assuming that because he believed they were designed, that was an application of design towards, flight or something like that. It really shocked me, because I thought, you need to establish that those were designed first. Then we can talk about how design has a use. But he didn't. And I'm not saying it wasn't designed. Like I said, I began the argument saying, let's just assume it's true, but I need you to show me the application of it. Right. And so that's why I looked the way I looked, because I was like, that you totally missed the point. But I will say this, I will give Nephilim credit. He was far more on topic than Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind never got back to the topic. He never even attempted to show an application of creationism, and I do mean young Earth creationism, right, of course. But so much to the point that at the end of it, we didn't even get to do our closing arguments because he just bailed out of the debate.
Oh, that's not good. So that actually brings up another quick topic, and Will, I know that we've been dominating the conversation for the last little bit, so I'll happily throw it to you after this for a reaction.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that the version of the people that we debate is determined by our approach, right? So I'm going to bring Matt Slick's name up. Even though Matt Slick, I don't know him to be a creationist. He might be, for all I know. He is a different person depending on how you approach the conversation. If he sees that you are coming in hot, he'll lean back, his hands behind his head, talk slowly, right? Like, his approach is like very like, oh, okay, now we'll just play the long game and do this, that, or the other. I kind of saw him do that with Skylar Fiction the other night, because Skylar Fiction came in hot. If you don't come in hot, he'll approach you very differently. He'll joke more. He'll concede more modesty. He'll be more humble. as humble as he can get, right?
Right.
But I do think that and I tried to have a conversation, the kind of discussion that we talked about earlier with Kent Hovind, and it seemed, I'm not going to read into his mind, but his behaviors gave the impression that he started getting uncomfortable when the thing he wanted to sink his teeth into wasn't getting anywhere. So like towards the end, it became really clear that he wanted me to answer the questions he asks people he debates. And me not doing that, me kind of sidestepping them and dismissing them was, it was driving him a little not so crazy. Right. So, yeah, I just think it depends on the approach that you take. Now, Will, have you done debates?
Yeah.
Are you a debating guy?
Yeah, I debated Jim Major. I'm a moderator on Modern Day Debate, and I've debated on there a few times. I debated Jim Majors. I debated on the Trinity. I debated Tom Jump on the definition of atheism. I've debated Scholar Fiction multiple times. One time was years ago when G Plus was a big thing. And recently, just like maybe, days. Yeah. So I just debated Scholar the other night as well, like just a couple of nights ago. Or actually, what is it? Today's Friday, so Wednesday night. And then I've got some other discussions set up, but I do live streams all the time where I welcome atheists and people with other beliefs to come in. So I had a channel years ago, and then I got off of YouTube completely because I was in construction, and then I've just come back within the last couple of months, started back on my channel. A lot of people remember me from then, and so I've actually got a lot of people are welcoming me, and I think it's because I'm doing kind of what you were just mentioning. I'm willing to have a rational conversation, and I'm willing to talk with anybody and do it in such a way that accommodates growth and progression. So, for example, I'm a moderator on Steve McRae's channel, but then again, I'm friends with Dragnot and Tom Jump and these guys. You see what I'm saying? So, a lot of the dynamics between the channels, like I'm learning, right? But I'm talking with everybody. Like, I wasn't that.
Wait a minute, you said Steve McRae. Who's that?
You don't remember him. You're like, I forgot who that guy was. Well, just like the other night, I didn't really know Raging Atheist. I had seen him a couple times before, but like he came on and we started talking and awesome guy. He was just like, hey man, I love the way you're having the discussion. I think that it's refreshing and I love it. So I agree with you that I like how Matt Slick does where he just kind of sits back and goes, all right, so you're saying you believe this, like, but I think you would even admit that the view that you gave of Kent Hovind, that there are plenty of atheists that have that same, when you start challenging their views, they start going, well, hold on, wait. No. And then they get into like this argumentative kind of atmosphere where now you're all of a sudden on the defensive and you're like, no, you are.
Yeah, some would say atheism is unstoppable. Others would say atheism is unbearable because they're just coming hot, so hot, for fucking no good reason. Now, I'm going to, JD, I know that you have to go. I think Drag already left. I'm happy to wrap this up with the stipulation that we have this discussion. We have this kind of discussion. Again, not necessarily maybe on Magic Sandwich Show. As often as you guys want to have this kind of conversation, I'm totally into it. But Will, Tony, if you guys wanted to have hangs with the three of us, continuing this conversation, I think that would be totally awesome. To people, whoever happens to watch this is watching it in real time or watches it to the end, I challenge you to write down atheist arguments. Give me a argument that promotes atheism, that supports the idea of atheism. An argument, not a tacit assumption, not an arbitrary admission, assertion, something that can be considered warranted by its justification through evidence. So with that, if it's okay with you, JD, we'll wrap it up.
All right. Go ahead and close it out, Matty.
Okay. For those of you that haven't already, smash the fucking subscribe button. Click likes, thumbs up for all this shit. There might even be a Patreon for this. If you have money in your pocket, even if it's goddamn lint, put it in an envelope and fax it to 1-800-THE-INTERNET. It'll show up into the fucking Magic Sandwich Show inbox. All of your money. Takes lots of time to do this shit. What am I doing? You know, promoting.
Are you okay?
Promoting and marketing.
Everything all
As
right?
perfected by the field of psychology. I'm persuading you, motherfuckers. So there are literally a team of people, hundreds, I think, that make this show happen. And in order for them to make the time to do the thing that is the thing that you love, because you're watching right now, please put your hand on your computer monitor and pray with me.
Isn't there just like 4 guys?
Shh. Hundreds, 400 guys that are doing this.
Isn't this just like their hobby?
Would you stop it?
I'm just asking questions.
Anyway.
Everybody asking questions.
That's it. That's it for
Thank
for
you all
this
for
time
watching,
around.
everybody. Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.